name's Dr. Mark Zumhagen. I'm a local guy from around here, and have a practice in Orland Park, and family practice, holistic practice. Really appreciate the people that put the conference together, Trinity. They're an amazing organization, and I really am honored that they asked me to speak here, and I'm honored that you came. I don't often do a lot of public speaking, I thought a long time about what I wanted to say here. I had two rules for myself, and we'll see if I can stick to those rules. I wasn't going to talk about vaccines, and I wasn't going to talk about COVID. And I thought, well, how can I make a relevant talk if I'm not talking about the things that seem to be getting my attention and everybody else's attention? And I really actually prayed about it and decided to take what I call a deep dive. So the name of the talk is, how did we get here and how do we get out? A brief historical and philosophical analysis of the role of science and medicine in the current times. It's almost as long as Darwin's title for his book, The Origin of Species. They always made those like short titles with a big title underneath. In my adventures of public speaking, I discovered I can either go off notes, in which case I sort of become dependent on the notes and then I'm sort of not talking to you anymore, or I can just wing it. So this is my attempt at winging it. The only scary thing about winging it is if you sort of lose your train of thought. So bear with me if that happens. I'll maybe just to set this up, I'll briefly say my attempt here is to connect three books that I've read and they really influenced me and caught my attention. The first one is Stephen Meyer's book, Return of the God Hypothesis. Highly recommended. And I'll be bringing that into the discussion. This one just came out this year. Neil Postman's book, Technopoly, which came out back in the 90s. We'll bring that in as well. And an even older one called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Thomas Kuhn, medical historian. And I'll briefly summarize those books and tell you sort of how that all comes into play. And underpinning it all will be this book, which is the Bible, which is, I think, the way we get out of this. I'll just mention as an aside, this was a book that got me on my path, Confessions of a Medical Heretic, Robert Mendelsohn. And one of my big role models was Dr. Meir Eisenstein, and I worked with him for 24 years doing home birth. Before I was doing my holistic health practice, I was running around Chicago, helping babies get delivered. It was exciting times, and one of my associates, Dr. Paul Shatter, is here today too, and he and I spent a long time and consulting with each other and having a lot of adventures. The way I'd like to get started is to just say there's all sorts of ways to approach the crisis, the upset that we live in. And a lot of it has to do with terminology, a lot of it has to do with defining terms. So I'm going to try to ease into this and just give you some general sense of what's happening now, because the only way we can understand what's happening now is if we see how it all got started. And I'm going to start with the idea of science. Did you know that science is a 19th century and 1800 term? Before the 1800s, there were no scientists. There were natural philosophers. And that is part of the story of why we're here. To understand the meaning of that term, science and scientist and natural philosopher. You know who is a very famous natural philosopher that you've probably all heard of before? Isaac Newton. He was a natural philosopher. And Kepler. and Copernicus, and Boyle. And what happened? What happened when the natural philosophers became scientists? Well, the whole scientific revolution, which was really from, say, roughly 1400 to 1700s. That's when Galileo, Newton, all these people that I just mentioned did most of their work, and it all had to do with cosmology. It all had to do with, deciding how the planets were rotating and realizing that we have now a sun-centered model, not an earth-centered model. And all these were amazing discoveries. And one of the things that really changed was we started to use math as a means of investigation in science. I'm a math major from college, so that sort of gets my attention when you realize it. You don't realize it, but we didn't have that usage before. We didn't use math to describe things. First started, you could say, with Newton and his with his theories of motion, F equals ma, theories of gravitation. You know what was the biggest criticism of Newton's theory when he came out with it? His critics didn't like his theory. He was talking about gravity and the effects of gravity. And they said, well, this is great, but what is gravity? What is it exactly? I mean, how does it work? And gravity was a strange concept at that time. We were, before Newton, we were using I can't say it, the teachings of Aristotle. There, it came out. We're using the teachings of Aristotle as our basis. And one of the things that allowed science, or natural philosophy as it was called then, to start was Christianity. Christianity was the basis for the development of our whole scientific enterprise. And it happened in Western civilization. Didn't happen in China, didn't happen in the Arab civilization, didn't happen in the Indian civilization, even though those were very advanced civilizations. And people have looked at that to try to figure it out. But one of the reasons science developed here is because there was one God, not many gods. He was a God of order. He was a God of intelligence. And the idea was, since we were made in God's image, we had given us a mind that could comprehend what he had created. And since he was one God, there weren't a lot of gods fighting about what was happening. Creation must be something we can figure out and we can measure. And so we take it for granted now, but there was a radical concept at this time. And it created the scientific revolution, which is really the basis of all of our technological advancements and everything that we've enjoyed today. But it came out of Western civilization because of the influence of Christianity. Another influence was Christianity recognized the immense potential of man, made in the image of God. That's again something we might take for granted living here in the United States, but it was an unusual idea. So it lifts man up. It gives him a sense of an exalted status. But at the same time, it brought in the idea of the fallenness of man as well. And so that brought out the idea of, when we do investigation, we have to be careful. We have to do science. We have to do experiments. We have to check them. We have to have peer review, because we know, because of the fallenness, we're either going to accidentally make mistakes or purposefully make deceptive mistakes. So there was this sense that science had to be investigational, but it also had to be taken apart, take place in an investigational fashion. It's interesting, the Greeks, we sort of broke away from Aristotle, because Aristotle and the Greeks had the idea that, you didn't need to really observe anything. You could sit back in your living room, your armchair, and figure it out. You'd say, well, since the circle is the perfect perfect geometric form, and God is perfect, therefore the planets must be traveling in circular orbits, because we just know that. So they use logic to say what God should do, rather than observing and just saying, what did he do? So they constrained God to their viewpoint of what he should do. So that kept us locked into a framework that today we would consider very unscientific, but that was the science of the day. I'm going to sort of use the word science loosely, but I'm going to just mention there was a fellow named Etienne Tempier, or Tempier, I guess we don't use the French pronunciation, 1277, Bishop of Paris. He condemned the Necessarian theology of the Greeks and said, we're going to separate from this. We're not going to just presume what God should do and make that our understanding of the world around us. So it's interesting how we often think of Christianity as maybe the force that's holding advancement back. Oh, you guys are stuck in this earth-centered model, but in fact it was the scientists that were holding the science back. Again, they were called natural philosophers, but it wasn't the church that was holding the development back. The church did go along with the idea that, okay, the earth's the center of the universe, and we'll support that from Scripture, but it turned out an unnecessary requirement. All that just to say that the science moved forward as Christianity moved forward. So then what happened? When did the natural philosophers become scientists? It's the Enlightenment. You perhaps have heard of that. It's in the 1700s, 1800s. It starts to exalt human knowledge, human capability, human understanding, human reason. So as we, through our understanding of God, unfold the secrets of the universe, we get sort of prideful. We get sort of arrogant. And we say, wow, we're figuring all this stuff out. We've got a lot of knowledge. And the Enlightenment is essentially a breakaway. It occurs over 100 or 200 years from the whole idea of God. It's like, you know what? We're figuring all this stuff out. I don't think we really need God to really explain anything anymore. When Newton explained the motions of the planets, he reflected on it, and he didn't say, you'll hear some people say, oh yeah, well Newton just said, hey, I figured it all out, we don't need God. No, Newton, if you read his work, said, I exalt the Lord, I praise the Lord, I can't believe the majesty of his creation. So when he was uncovering these scientific discoveries, he was amazed, and it just connected him back tighter to God. So then we see this disconnect happening in the Enlightenment. And I'll read you an Enlightenment statement from Pierre-Simon de Laplace, 1814. So a little bit at the end of the Enlightenment. He's sort of the progression of the Enlightenment coming into the 1800s. A mind that in a given instance knew all the forces by which nature is animated and the position of all the bodies of which it is composed, if it could embrace in one single formula the movements of the largest bodies of the universe and the smallest atoms, nothing would be uncertain for him. The future and the past would be equally before his eyes. So the idea is we're getting so good at figuring things out and investigating, there's nothing we can't do. We can just continue to uncover all the secrets of the universe and explain them in more and more materialistic terms. This reaches this culmination in 1859 with Charles Darwin, The Origin of the Species, where he describes the theory of evolution. And my premise today, I'll just cut to the chase a little bit, is that this is the foundation for many of our problems that we're seeing, especially in medicine and biology today. The theory of evolution essentially proposes that all life developed from a single life form. In most cases, they're talking about just like a single bacterium. We don't know where the bacterium came from exactly, but that's a small detail, right? And from that bacterium, every single life form that we see on the planet is derived. It was partially supported by the idea that as the fossil record was being discovered, there was a progression. There was layers where there wasn't much of anything but maybe one-celled organisms, and then there was some fishes, and then there were some amphibians, and there's some reptiles, and there's some mammals, and then there's finally man. And so because they're seeing this progression, there were many people who saw that progression and maintained themselves as theists. They still believe in God. Richard Owen is one of the big names of the time in the 1800s. But Darwin took it another step, and everybody was sort of ready. He actually held back. He didn't publish that book till the end of his life. And he held back from publishing it. He was waiting for the time to be right. And the time was right. And people received it. And what it did was it presupposes that there is, in a sense, it explains the origin of life, the development of life, the development of all that we see in the biological realm without invoking God, and actually purposefully saying, we're not going to invoke God in any explanation. Because, and this is in the 1800s when we came up with the term science and scientist. We moved away from the idea of natural philosophy. And we always hear how science is fighting religion, right? You know why we hear that? Because the very definition of science is anti-religion. As a Christian, I always say, you know, I'm not afraid of science. God designed all this, so anything I discover isn't going to interfere with my belief in God or my understanding of who He is. But really, we have to realize science is being, in a sense, defined much more narrowly than the way we're usually using it. Science is being defined as a process that explains only in the natural realm and refuses to enter in any way into the supernatural realm. Obviously, when we want to do something practical, it's very practical to figure out how things are happening in the natural realm. But this definition of science will not only focuses on the natural realm, but also makes a comment about the spiritual realm that either doesn't exist or isn't anything we're going to be getting interested in. I'm just going to throw out a couple definitions that I think are worth knowing, even though they're sort of big words. A methodological naturalist. Has anybody heard that term used before? It's a term we should actually all know. A methodological naturalist is a person that only looks at nature. I should say what it's differentiated from. It's differentiated from a philosophical naturalist. A philosophical naturalist said, there's no spirit realm. It's only what we can see, and there is no God. A methodological naturalist doesn't go that far. He says, I'm only going to look at what I see, and there may be a God out there, but I'm not ever going to bother with it. Francis Collins, the head of the NIH, considers himself a Christian and a methodological naturalist. I think it's a very dangerous position because we exclude God from any explanation. And as soon as you exclude God, you exclude God's morals. You exclude the sense of design. You get into dangerous territory. But something interesting, and I want to bring in one of these books right now, otherwise I'll run out of time. this book, Return of the God Hypothesis, Stephen Meyer. What Stephen Meyer points out is when we dig in to the natural world, we bump into God. Unavoidably, he's there. And there's 3 events that he brings in they're relatively recent scientific discoveries that scream for the existence of God. One is what we call the Big Bang Theory. It happened in the 1930s, and it was sort of confirmed by 1960. But originally, astronomers were feeling pretty comfortable with the idea that, we probably don't have to think about God because the universe has sort of always been there. It's an eternal entity, and that's the source of all power, and we never really have to think too much about God. I could do about 30 lectures because each of these topics deserves its own lecture, but basically the Big Bang was when astronomers, Edwin Hubble, discovered there's a redshift and was able to show that the whole galaxy isn't in a steady state, it's actually moving out. And then if you extrapolate backwards in time, all of a sudden there's a beginning. And all of a sudden starts to sound like Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. One of my favorite quotes is by a astronomer of the time who was not known for being a theological or a Christian person. His name was Robert Jastrow, and he said, "Science has had extraordinary success in tracing the chain of cause and effect backward in time. For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries." So this is an interesting phenomenon. There was a large number of astronomers in the community as this was coming out that gave up their atheism and realized, I'm looking at the stars and there is a God. It's very interesting. It goes along with one of the scriptures in the Psalm 19. The heavens declare the glory of God. The firmament sheweth his handiwork. Day unto day uttereth speech. Night unto night sheweth knowledge. So even in the Bible, it tells us we're going to see God if we look up. So it's interesting as the realm of physics and chemistry, you could say, was coming into this idea that what we're looking at, there has to be an explanation outside of created order. Let me just explain why that works. If we truly have a beginning and we start with nothing, nothing can't create something. There has to be something that's pre-existent to get the whole thing started. And there's only Stephen Meyer does a good job of talking about this doesn't prove there's a God. But when we look at the different choices, it does make it seem like the best choice. He calls it reasoning to the best explanation. The other thing that started getting people's attention was the fine-tuning of the universe. If we look at all the physical constants, gravity, strong nuclear force, weak nuclear force, the electromagnetic force, all of these forces are tuned to, you can't even think of the number, it's 1 to gazillionth, more zeros than you can fit in the room, that if it was slightly deviated, nothing would work. Again, you can go to that book and get all the details. It's a very well-written book. It's 400 pages, very thorough to go through the details of what I'm talking about. But it's the Return of God Hypothesis. It will be on the QR code, so you'll get all the book titles. So this was another thing that started shifting scientists into this idea that there's no way we can explain the fine-tuningness of everything unless there's somebody behind this that's making everything perfect. Now, the atheist scientists have come up with an alternate explanation. They say it's a multiverse. They say there's like a gazillion universes, and we just happen to be in the one that's perfect. But there's a gazillion out of there that aren't perfect. You can't observe them, you can't find them, we just know they must be there because we don't want to believe in God. So increasingly, you find that there's a strong move, which started in the Enlightenment, to sort of shake your hand at the Creator and say, you're not there, and I'm just going to go the way I want to go. So the first thing is the Big Bang. Second is the fine-tuning. The third thing, so just when the biologists thought they were free from these kind of problems, along comes Francis Crick, 1953. We get the DNA molecule. You know what was so revolutionary about the DNA molecule? Discovering the structure of DNA. There's information in the cell. And you know, when I took biology back in high school in the 70s, nobody emphasizes this, of course, because I was learning about the theory of evolution. I nearly became an atheist when I was in high school because the theory of evolution seemed so attractive to me. But I'm just going to mention, they were shocked when they found there was coding information in the cell. And the coding information didn't get there because the molecules fit that way because of the chemical bonds. No, the code was there in a specified order, hundreds or thousands of chains of code, you know, more code than you get in a book. So it would be sort of like you found this book and you just said, I think all those words just sort of came together randomly. You can't even imagine that. And we really have to say the same thing about the information in the cells. It's God screaming at us. But again, it's interesting. It's not an absolute proof. Nothing is an absolute proof that God is there. That, in a certain sense, that's a faith issue. But the scientists have faith issues too. The scientists also build their viewpoint on presuppositions, that they can measure things, that the measurements will be accurate, that there is order in the universe. Many of the presuppositions that Newton used, except they, again, leave God out of the picture. But basically, this book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, is about those three ideas that have, in our exploration of the natural world, make us realize there may be something beyond that. There may be a supernatural arena that needs to be acknowledged. I'm going to mention, maybe what I'll do is mention some of the problems with the theory of evolution that weren't mentioned to me when I was in high school. I didn't realize, I thought it was such a complete theory and I thought it made so much sense until I started doing a little bit more investigation and realized there were three big questions that it never answered. One was, how did the universe get started? Didn't really tell me that. And originally, the answer was, oh, it was eternal. It never did get started. But now that we know it got started, we have to ask that question. The next is, how did life begin? They spent many, many years trying to make life. So you're talking about starting with physics and chemistry and making a living cell, or even, you know, a living entity. Right now we're at the stage of give us time, we'll still figure it out. But I don't think it's ever going to figure it out if you look at the complexity of the cell. As a matter of fact, I think if Darwin had tried to get his theory going today, it wouldn't have happened. Because he presumed that those little blobs of cells that you could see under the microscope were just little bits of matter. Now when we look inside the cell, we see there's as much complexity in one cell as there is in an entire organism. In terms of the the different organelles in there, the processes they're having. It's like an assembly line in there. There are some great animations on YouTube that recreate the working of the cell. Actually, Stephen Meyer's organization called the Discovery Institute has many of them up there. It's fascinating. And we would talk about DNA, dividing, and then and with mitosis and meiosis, and the DNA strands unfold, and then the matching molecules come in, and then you have two cells. And you could sort of do it on paper, but when you watch it on the recreation, it's going 50 base pairs per second. So it's literally going, and then it's going, everything's coming in. It's like this, and you can't even follow it. Like, what is happening? So again, we sort of delude ourselves. We can explain things on paper, but when we see how it actually works out, we realize this is miraculous. So we don't know how the universe began. We don't know how life began. And the other big thing that you may not think about as much is how did consciousness begin? We take it for granted because we see it every day. We're all aware of ourselves. We can talk to people. But we don't realize we're really crossing a barrier there. Because most everything we can describe in terms of a chemical event, like, oh, my body's making cholesterol, and my body's making hopefully more good cholesterol than bad cholesterol, and my body's making thyroid hormone. But the mind has to be more than chemicals. If it's just chemicals, that means everything I'm saying here is just a random event that would have happened anyway, right? It's predetermined. But a mind is an independent entity. A mind is almost like an interface into that spiritual realm that we're trying to deny. So to this day, actually after James Watson discovered with Crick, discovered the DNA molecule, he spent the rest of his life trying to find the materialistic explanation for consciousness, and he never found it. Because there is no materialistic explanation for consciousness. And that gets back to the idea that we really are the image of God. If we depart into a materialistic viewpoint of life, and we lose the image of God, all the bad things happen. So my plea today is for us to recapture that sense of wonder, that sense of awe. It needs to pervade our biology. Because we can talk about crisis control. That's what we're in right now. We're in crisis control. But how did the crisis start? The crisis started with this movement away from God, this denial. Because if the whole enterprise of science started with our relationship and understanding of God, and now we've thrown God out of the picture, is it any wonder that we live in a society of confusion, disruption, anger, furor? One of the quotes I would like to read to you is sort of what our choices are. There's two ways we can go. There's two paths before us. The first path is, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. The second option is, from eternity past were the particles and the energy. And the particles arranged themselves into more complex chemicals. The chemicals arranged themselves into the first cell. And the first cell evolved by Darwinian processes to produce more complex forms of life. And then one of those forms of life, man, conceived the idea of God. Those are the two paths. I want to summarize them for you briefly. The first path starts with mind and goes to material. The second path starts from material and goes to mind. And what we're bumping into, the more we dig down into science, the more we see you cannot start with material and get to mind. It's impossible. You can't. And we have to ask ourselves, what will happen if we stay stuck in this paradigm? And how do we get out of it? One of the books that gives me a little bit of a clue is this book here, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. I'll have to define it in about 1 minute. It just says that science doesn't progress by an accumulation of knowledge. It progresses in jumps, a model, and then another model, and then another model. First, the Earth's the center of the universe. Then that data doesn't fit. We jump into the next model. Nope, the sun's the center of the universe. And the models change as we get new data. The theory of evolution is the perfect model because it explains everything. It's tidy and it makes sense. The only problem is it has nothing to do with the truth. But in the sense of being a model, of being a coherent model, and giving us a sort of a self-satisfied feeling, it's great. Do you know? So you have to ask yourself, if the theory of evolution isn't true, how can it exist? I mean, why didn't we just jettison it? I'll tell you one reason, and I don't know if I've ever heard anybody articulate this very precisely, but I'm going to say it. There's nothing you do in biology that depends on the theory of evolution. Nothing. It could go away tomorrow. Nothing would change. We'd have the same biology. We'd have the same investigation. Nothing changed. It provides no useful information to your present day application of science or technology. It is merely a creation myth story that's inculcated into all of our children and to all of our society to tell us we can be comfortable there's no God. And so what do we give up when we give up God? We give up our origin, we give up the image of God, the sanctity of life, we give up our purpose, we give up our destiny, we give up our morality. Because what's the morality of evolution? Survival of the fittest. It's a dog-eat-dog world out there. There's no love, there's no altruism. This is dangerous. And you have to go all the way down to the foundation for this to change. We can solve the COVID crisis. We can solve the vaccine crisis. We could solve everything. If we don't get back to God, first of all, we will never solve it if we don't. How did we get so many bad actors running this world? It's because we surrendered God a long time ago, 1859, and we embraced him. So how do we back out? I've got, how many minutes here? How many? 12 minutes. Oh boy, that's a lot of time. I think what I'll do is I'm going to back out in 5 minutes and then I'll give you time for questions. I apologize if this has been a little disjointed because I've been struggling with these ideas for a while, trying to figure out how do I put it together into a coherent presentation. I'm not sure I exactly succeeded, but I just wanted, the message I want to leave you with is we have to find a way to, if we truly are made in the image of God, if life truly is valuable and precious and meaningful, if there is a God who is a God of love, who created us, we have to find a way to acknowledge him. Does that mean that we drastically change our scientific experiments? It doesn't change anything except it will make us a more ethical people. You know, we won't abort babies to make our vaccines and things like that. I see couldn't get away without mentioning you could have. I tried. I really did try. But I don't think we can fully appreciate the consequences of what it means to kick out the creator of the universe from what we're doing in investigational biology. I think it leads us down unethical paths, manipulative paths, evil paths. And then the question then is, well, does that mean we stop? Well, here's the question, and actually it's raised in Thomas Kuhn's book. How do we replace the theory of evolution with another paradigm? I'm going to tell you we can't. There is no paradigm, because paradigms involve materialism, and we're talking about going outside of materialism. We still conduct biology, but we do it like Newton did. We find our discoveries, nothing changes there, but we acknowledge God. We say, this is amazing, this is incredible. I wish my biology teacher had showed me how the cell worked, and they just said, have you ever seen anything more awesome in your life? I mean, we can't even exactly figure out how it's happening. We can watch it happen, but we can't totally explain it. We're going to keep trying, but there's amazing things happening. Let me just tell you in 2 seconds what this book's about, Technopoly. This one talks about how when we take away religion, technology goes wild and runs its own course, and we don't even control it anymore. It's very much, it's a very good book, worth the read. And he talks about like that we start making everything science so that it can be an absolute truth. And I'd like to just leave at this point because I thought it was so good when he made it. We take observational sciences like chemistry and physics, and then we take behavioral sciences like sociology and psychology, and we say this, psychology and sociology are looking at behavioral patterns, not absolute law-driven entities. But when we put that and give it the same standing and call it science, now we try to explain everything in terms of science. In other words, like, we're going to help the homeless because we did a study and it showed that there are bad consequences to homelessness, rather than just saying, you know what, you're made in the image of God, I'm going to show love and compassion to you, I'm going to help you out. Everything has to be couched in terms of science. And here's, you know, you wondered why the mask mandates and all that are so, mentioning again, so full of hatred. It's because science, morality comes from what we ought to do. I ought to be kind to you. I ought to feed you. I ought to help you. But when science becomes our moral code, what does it do? Based on this study, this was what should be done. You have to do this. It's dictatorial. And it's not based on your freedom of will to do the right thing. It's based on you have to do this because science is the absolute. When we have God as our authority, we have freedom, we have love. If we jettison God, we will live under an authority, but that authority will be the state. And it's a different picture. So what's my prescription for the answer? Go back to church, worship the Lord in spirit and in truth, and don't send your children into an environment that teaches them that they are a piece of slime that came from nowhere, that's going nowhere, that has no ultimate purpose. I mean, if you think of it, that is inculcated into our children, unless they're homeschooled or in a Christian school or in a religious school, Judeo or Judeo-Christian upbringing, they're given that. And even if they sort of keep that in the background, it's always there. It's always there informing their opinions and their ideas. It took me a long time to undo my public school education, mostly through reading the Bible. But I think it's very dangerous to think that we can proceed along that path and not be very much damaged, very much affected by it. So I want this to be a message of hope. There is a way out. And the noise is going to keep getting worse and worse and worse and worse until we make the correction. We have to make the course correction. It has to go all the way down to the foundation. And that's my message. Do I have any time? How much time?
5 more minutes.
All right. Wow. That's unusual. Go ahead.
First of all, I want to say that I was raised in school when evolution was taught and everything, and I have never heard explained the background to science. So thank you very much. This is very beneficial and informative. And also thank you for your long time investment in this area. You're appreciated.
Oh, thank you.
You were talking about how you can't use the material to get to the mind. Can you provide a definition in terms of what you mean when you say material?
So, in other words, your choice is this mind is either something amazing that has an independent existence, or else it's not a mind, it's a brain, and it's just chemicals bouncing around in there, and everything that's happening is based on material. It's just physics and chemistry. But if that was true, if it's just physics and chemistry, that means there's nothing independent. There's something independent happening outside of physics and chemistry. We call it a mind, we see it every day, but and so just because we see it doesn't mean we can really understand it. It's really bizarre when you think about it. Go ahead.
The book title, did you say Technopolis?
Technopoly, Neil Postman. He also wrote a great book called The Disappearance of Childhood and Amusing Ourselves to Death. Back in the 90s, he was talking about the influence of screens. Very interesting. He was just mostly talking about television at the time. He had no conception of this. But he was prescient, quite ahead of his time. Yes, back there.
What are your thoughts on autism and the mind?
Yes. So the mind is so complex. And it is, so some people, everybody has sort of as a theory, some people think the mind is like an energy field. And our brain is sort of like your television set, where it's getting the signal from out here. Maybe you carry an energy field around you, and this is a transducer that's tapping into that field, or maybe it's a spirit. We don't know, but the brain is an interface unit with the mind. And when the brain is damaged, as in autism, it's like the mind is there, but it's a distorted signal. We can't quite get to it. And you can talk to children with autism. I was at Autism One about 2 or 3 years ago. Matteo Musso was there. You talk to Matteo, and he goes like this, yeah. And then he sat down at his computer, and he said, I'm in here, and I can hear everything you're saying, and I know exactly what everything you just said to me. And he's speaking these complex sentences, and you realize the mind is more amazing than we could possibly imagine. The autism is it truly is a spectrum. You have children that can't communicate, but they can receive. You can have children that perhaps can't do either, but we can't be sure. We can't ever know how much are they really hearing us, even though they may not appear to. But there's definitely one of the most important things that I see related to the mind being damaged, and I won't say how, but it is damaged. is you lose eye contact. And the eye contact is one of the first things you see lose with autism. And I believe I had some challenges in my growing up from these entities, and I always had trouble looking at people in the eye. I don't know how well I did on the presentation here, but I have to force myself sometimes to look at people. And I feel that might be an influence from my childhood. Yes, Dr. Shatar. This is my former associate, Dr. Paul Shatar. He and I worked together for many years. He's
I want to thank Mark. Get emotional. Because he has meant so much to me in my life, as far as, and it has to do with relationship. Because I grew through my professional career, I learned pretty much everything I know with Mark, and making it through a lot of good times and really a lot of challenges. And he was always right there for me. And that's my question, is the question I have has to do with relationship, because it seems like you're bringing that up as far as how important the relationship is between all of us, and how when we finally get together like this, it becomes even more powerful. And I wonder if you could speak on the kind of the relationship between mind and collective, like a collective consciousness.
Yes. So I'll make a comment about that. Who am I going to attribute this to? John Lennox gave a great talk, and he said, if you want to get to know me, you can take my blood test, you can take a look at my cells under the microscope, you can look at my physics, and you can look at my chemistry. But how do you get to know me? We talk, we share a conversation, we have a relationship, like you're saying. Our minds are interengaging. That is relationship. And how does God get our attention? Relationship. It's all about human, and the amazing thing, not only human relationship, but relationship with our Creator. And that's, I believe there's an enemy that is mentioned here that really tries to destroy any vestige of God, your image as a God, as being created in the image of God, goes after life, goes after children. We see this is the frontal point of all the attack. That's why we have to meet it right back. Exalt the Lord, exalt our station as created beings in His image, love every life, human life on the planet, regardless of their creed, color, race, or orientation, and just bring the God of love into their life, because we see the other side, don't we? It's so obvious. I mean, it's being split now. I call up certain pharmacies, and you can hear fear, hate, anger, and you call up others, and they're on the different path. And it's interesting how that path is a path of love, relationship, community, fellowship. It's like night and day. And I so appreciate being at this conference, because you do feel this sense of being lifted up. We're all here fighting the fight. And guess what? We're winning. And we actually know, as you get close to the end of the book, we actually have won already. So, right? So, are we done?